On this episode of China Uncensored, it's Cold War II, Electric Boogaloo, but with less dancing and more espionage. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. A bomb dropped at the Aspen Security Forum last week. Okay, a figurative bomb. The director of the FBI revealed that the biggest long-term threat to the United States right now is Russia. Just kidding.
Well, I think China, from a counterintelligence perspective, in many ways represents the broadest, most challenging, most significant threat we face as a country. We have economic espionage investigations in every state, all 50 states, that trace back to China.
Really? The FBI has opened investigations into Chinese spying in all 50 states? Like, I totally get California for technology, or New York for finance, or Hawaii for the military bases, and surfing. But what are Chinese spies going to steal in, like, Iowa? What's that, Shelley? Okay, corn. They stole corn. Look, I don't want to play into stereotypes here, but shouldn't they be stealing our rice? What's that, Shelley? They did steal rice from Kansas. Okay then, moving on. The FBI is not alone in raising an alarm about Chinese spies in America. Here's Michael Collins from the CIA.
By their own terms, and what Xi Jinping himself enunciates, I would argue what they're waging against us is fundamentally a Cold War. A Cold War not like we saw during the Cold War, but a Cold War by definition. A country that exploits all avenues of power, licit and illicit, public and private, economic, military, to undermine the standing of your rival relative to, your own standing, without resorting to conflict.
Okay, I got it. It's not the Cold War, it's a Cold War. But on the plus side, it kind of validates what I've been saying on China Uncensored for the past 6 years. It almost sounds like the CIA is taking money from me. That's a terrible idea. Please don't take my money. But it's not just U.S. intelligence officials speaking out about what's going on with the Chinese regime. U.S. politicians are talking about it too.
The biggest issue of our time, in my view, and I think in the view of most of the members of this committee, and I would venture to guess most of the members of this panel, is China and the risks they pose. I'm not sure in the 240-some-odd-year history of this nation we've ever faced a competitor and potential adversary of this scale, scope, and capacity.
But one thing to remember is that even though we're in a Cold War, the good old days of the Cold War, spy versus spy, are history. You know, the simpler times when an Iron Curtain separated the Soviet East from the Free West and Russian spies had Austrian accents.
How do you Soviets deal with all the tension and stress? Vodka.
Today, the Cold War between the US and China is much more complex.
The United States and Soviet Union had minimal interaction in the economic and academic spheres as the two sides maintained strict barriers to mutual trade and academic exchanges. Today, by contrast, the United States and China are deeply intertwined in economic trade, academic, and other realms, posing unique challenges for the United States across a range of areas.
A lot of these Cold War strategies that CIA official Michael Collins mentioned earlier were outlined in the 1999 book Unrestricted Warfare, written by two Chinese People's Liberation Army colonels. They clearly understood the strategic use of lasers, space planes, and random planets to strike fear in the hearts of people in the 90s. But they also had a deep understanding of how to wage subtle warfare against the US in ways that were hard to counteract. For example, by using financial influence to change Hollywood plotlines to be pro-Beijing, like in Transformers 4, where Hong Kong citizens looked to the Chinese government to rescue them.
We gotta call the central government for help.
Or by setting up Confucius Institutes across the US to teach free Chinese classes and, in exchange, control the conversation about how China is portrayed. Always as a benevolent partner, in case you were wondering. And yes, they even have Confucius Institutes in Iowa. And honestly, that stuff is just the tip of the iceberg. Here's a 30-page report the White House published in June that lists dozens of ways the Chinese regime is trying to undermine the US by buying or stealing or even using so-called Chinese law to forcibly transfer American technology. For example, They have laws that force U.S. companies to surrender key technologies to Chinese authorities, such as source code and encryption algorithms, as a requirement to operate in the Chinese market. And then, the Chinese regime plans to use this technology to eventually outcompete U.S. companies in China and around the world. It's a type of economic and ultimately political warfare. The Chinese Communist Party has been doing this stuff for a long time, but it seems that in just the past few months, U.S. officials have been far more vocal about their concerns than at any time I can recall. This bill, sponsored by U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, aims to have more than a dozen congressional committees share intelligence and produce an unclassified report on the Chinese Communist Party's political influence operations in the U.S. And it also aims to share intelligence on the Communist Party with Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Taiwan, which all face similar threats. Which sounds like a pretty good idea. At least people are finally starting to realize what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. If only there had been a way for people to find out about these issues years ago on, for example, some kind of YouTube channel. Speaking of which, I'm going to coin the phrase Cold War II. That's right, you heard it first on China Uncensored. Wait, what's that, Shelley? Cold War II is the name of a B-movie from Hong Kong. Ugh. So what do you think? Leave your comments below. And before we go, it's time for me to answer a question from one of our fans who contributes $1 or more per episode via the crowdfunding website Patreon. Wolf Shu asks, there is a rationale among many Chinese that since China is so large and diverse, implementing American-style democracy on its political system right away will only bring about chaos, like what happened in Iraq or Syria, if not worse. I'm wondering if you want to comment on that. Good question, Wolf. To understand the rationale that China can't handle democracy, first look at who the main supporters of that rationale are. Why, it's Chinese state-run media. Yes, democracy is not a universal truth, nor is it a universal way to solve the problem of governing the country. Look, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want Western-style democracy in China because it knows that a lot of people would reject the party if given the choice. But would democracy even work in China? Well, it worked well in Taiwan, which is full of Chinese people. And it's also worked decently in India, which has a population almost as big as China. If, over the last 5,000 years, China could build some of the most glorious civilizations the world had ever seen, it can certainly handle a little democracy. Now, I'm not saying American-style democracy is the only path China could take, but anyone who says Chinese people aren't capable of having democracy is either buying into the Communist Party's false agenda or just being racist. Jackie Chan. Thanks for your question, Wolf, and thank all of you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time. Want your questions answered? Of course you do. Click this orange button and sign up to support China Uncensored by pledging $1 or more per episode on the crowdfunding website Patreon. There's a lot of cool perks, and one of them is having me potentially answer your questions at the end of my episodes. Click here to support the show.